life felt as though the world is just coming to an end. After hearing what Jesus had to say about the destruction of the temple, 4 of his disciples, just 4, well, probably all of them, but in particular the 4 mentioned, surely felt this way, as though the world at long last was coming to an end. Now, the fancy word for this kind of thought is, as many of you know, apocalyptic. Everything and anything having to do with the end of the world, the end of times, apocalypse. We peruse the pages of history and we recall that a great many people throughout history have predicted, or if you prefer the phrase, prophesied the end of the world. Each of them declared in so many words, if I may borrow the phrase, apocalypse now. Way back in the year 1806, in the English town of Leeds, this was a favorite of mine, a rumor circulated that a hen was laying eggs on which the phrase, Christ is coming, was written. How about that? Has that ever happened in Bucks County, PA? The rumor convinced the farmers' neighbors that the end of the world was indeed at hand, and then somebody decided to do something. They actually watched the hen laying the eggs. Turned out the eggs were pretty much normal. No writing, nothing etched on the eggs. It was discovered that someone had, if I may, hatched a hoax. No. Hatched a hoax. Even less response the second time around. Never been to that. Way back in 1835, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, called a meeting of his church leaders, a very important meeting, an urgent meeting. As the story goes, he shared with them that he had been conversing with God, that he had entered into dialogue with God, and he learned throughout this dialogue that God would return in the next 56 years, which would usher in, at long last, the end of the world, the end times, apocalypse, now or at least in the near future. Now, without besmirching the history and the character of the Mormon faith, our Mormon neighbors, this much is definitely true. Joseph Smith got it wrong. Back in the late 90s, a handful of people used the writings of the great Nostradamus to substantiate their claim that the world was indeed about to come to an end. The Nostradamus quote reads as follows, if I may. The year 1999, 7th month, from the sky will come great king of terror. The students of Nostradamus argued that this was his vision of the end times, the end of the world. Finally, at long last, it's here, 1999. Well, 1999 came, and it meant that was a pretty good year for me. I got married that year. The world didn't end, did it? Way back in the 19th century, a New England farmer named William Miller, he studied his Bible, and he became convinced that God's chosen time to cast judgment upon the world and destroy the world could be divined from a very literal interpretation of the Scriptures. And this would happen, he said, sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. He preached a lot, he published a lot, his followers were known as Millerites. They changed the date on him. They went with April 23rd, 1843. Lots of people either gave away their possessions or sold their possessions thinking, we don't need all of that stuff. April 23rd arrived, but my friends, Jesus did not. How did Miller respond? Well, he said, and I quote, you've got to love this, I confess my error, I acknowledge my disappointment, but I still believe that the day of the Lord is near, even at the door. That sort of leaves it wide open, doesn't it? After a while, the group disbanded. Some of them formed a movement called the Seventh-day Adventists. Not so long ago, the 20th century drew to a close. You remember that. Lots of people, assisted by the media, went into a panic, a frenzy about the end of the world. Do you remember this Y2K? The problem, first noted way back in the 1970s, is that computers, at least most of them, would have trouble distinguishing between 1900 dates and 2000 dates. Best I recall, nobody had a clue how to solve this problem. And the list of catastrophes predicted went on and on and on, from blackouts to a nuclear holocaust that would dominate every inch of God's green earth. Did that happen? No. Over and over and over again, self-proclaimed prophets and predictors, they have prophesied the end of the world. A great many have looked up at the heavens, pointed and said, look, the sky is falling. This is it. This is it indeed, the end of the world. And they turned out, every single one of them thus far, to be 100% wrong. I am reminded of what the great Yankees manager Casey Stengel once said, the wisdom of Casey Stengel. Never make predictions, especially about the future. Smart man. But I do wonder this morning, have you ever felt as though the world is coming to an end? You've probably heard the phrase, oh, this is it. A sign that the world is truly coming to an end. Have you ever felt as though danger is looming everywhere, and there's nothing that we can do about it? It cannot be escaped. My grandparents felt this way a long, long time ago. Edith Massengill, Olin Massengill. They were members of what Tom Brokaw, I think, correctly refers to as the greatest generation. Somehow, some way, I sometimes wonder how they did it. They made their way through the Great Depression and the Second World War. Now, my father remembers that my grandfather, who had started a coal brokerage business, loaded up an old truck with coal. And he made his way around the neighborhood, making rounds. He took coal to neighbors who used that coal. They burned it to keep their homes warm throughout the winter. He remembered hearing about neighbors who were losing their homes. He remembered hearing about men who stood in long lines for hours waiting for a loaf of bread so that they could put food on the table that evening. I can still remember the way that my grandmother, Edith, put it more than once. I can remember this as though it was yesterday. We felt as though the world was coming to an end. It was the Depression, and then piggybacking on that, the Second World War. We felt as though everything was just falling apart. The world was coming to an end, and we desperately needed for somebody to come along and remind us that the world was not going to end, that the world was not falling apart. And one might argue that finally, at long last, my grandmother's prayer was answered, the prayers of many. A recently elected president named Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the American people on March 4th, 1933, his inaugural address. He spoke the following words, words etched in the American psyche. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Immortal words. But it's actually just one portion of a much larger speech. One portion of a paragraph which goes like this. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential, he said, essential to victory. A few years later, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that same president spoke these words, and I quote, "No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Hostilities exist, There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, our interests are in grave danger. But with confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. And here's a phrase: so help us God. Now, it is true that Jesus, as in Jesus of Nazareth, the Jesus we find in the Bible, never uttered the phrase, "We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God." He never spoke those words. And it is equally true that Jesus never uttered the words, "The only thing that we have to fear is fear itself." But he did speak words that, with all due respect to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a great president, words that are equally powerful and equally reassuring about the future. Even more reassuring, actually, because the future that Jesus has in mind transcends every nation, every creed, every constitution, even the world itself. The future that Jesus has in mind is eternity. A future which stands beyond all time and all space. He turns to his audience, and this is a rather small audience for Jesus. 4 disciples. Where are the other 8? I don't know. That's one of those 7 sermons that I'd really like to preach. But he says to them, do not be alarmed. Just don't. Translation, don't be anxious, fellas. Don't worry. Do not be afraid. Another translation, as tempting as it may be to think that this marks the end of the world, the destruction of the temple, I am here to tell you that God is God, and because God is God, this is not the end of the world. Tempting as it may be to fear the loss of a particular understanding of God rooted in history, I hope that you fellas can find solace and strength in the assurance that because God is God, the future is secure. How is it that the old liturgy of the Gloria Patri goes, world without end? Amen and amen. His disciples have been listening carefully, at least we hope they have been. This highly distressing, disturbing news that the temple is going to crumble to the ground, piece by piece, stone by huge, impressive stone. The temple, which stands at the heart of Jewish life. It's everything. It's where God lives. What they have heard in so many words from Jesus is that the world, as they have known it, is about to fall apart. How many times have we stood in the shoes, the sandals of the disciples? We listen to the evening news. At least some of us still listen to the evening news. We read the newspapers. We go on CNN.com, FoxNews.com. And what I must mention when I say FoxNews.com is MSNBC.com, the New York Times.com, WallStreetJournal.com, and we read and we read and we read and we conclude sometimes that the world is just crumbling to pieces, falling apart right before our very eyes. This past week we were confronted with horrible and heartbreaking news. Thousands of residents of Paris and tourists were enjoying their evening meals, taking evening strolls. Fans were watching a soccer game, France versus Germany, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, piercing the joie de vivre, gunfire. It seems that yet again, terrorists are to blame. armed with guns, as usual, and with bombs, tools of destruction. As of last night, 129 dead, 352 injured, many of them critically. Most of you already know that these attacks constitute the worst violence on French soil since World War II, and the worst in Europe since 2004. Still more sad, heartbreaking news to be added to decades worth of news about, if I may quote Jesus, wars and rumors of wars. So how do we muster the courage? How do we do this? How do we muster the courage to believe in our hearts that the world really and truly isn't falling apart? How do we muster the strength to keep on going when it seems as though the world is coming to an abrupt halt? How do we, amidst all of the carnage and all of the conflict, muster the hope to believe that the future is in God's hands, even when it seems, and I know this is true, even when it seems that God is nowhere to be found? How do we do this? If anybody should know how to do this, it ought to be us, right? People of faith. Who said faith? This was not rehearsed. Kay absolutely gets it 100% right. Faith. That's what it's all about. It always comes back to faith. Not in some treaty, not in a declaration of war, after all, not in the human capacity for peacemaking, but faith in God. And more particularly, the love of God. In the end, that's all I have as a preacher of the gospel. It's all that we have as the church. It's all the world has. I love the way that St. Paul put it a great many years ago. Okay, like 2,000 years ago. He wrote a letter to a bunch of Christians living in the city of Rome. And they believed, I must tell you, that their world was changing so rapidly that it seemed as though it was falling apart. Paul wrote these words: "My friends, who will separate us from the love of Christ? What will separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship of any kind separate us from the love of God that we find in Jesus Christ? No. Will distress, will persecution, will famine, nakedness, peril, the sword, which is code for violence? No, in all of these things, all of this hard stuff, we are more than conquerors through Him who has and will continue to love us. For I am convinced," Paul says, "that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything that we read about in the newspapers or here on the evening news, nothing will separate us from the love of God that has been made known to us in Jesus Christ."